The wind whirled around outside as the hikers huddled around in their tent, settling in for the night. Dubonino was drifting off to sleep, the warmth of the stove a bit unbearable. Its heat welcoming, but she stripped most of her clothing to keep from sweating. One of the hikers unzips the front of the tent and steps out into the cold, windy night. She can't tell who it is, it's too dark. He's got a flashlight in his hand and he stands there for a moment before relieving himself. When, almost in an instant, he cries out. The group is startled awake when suddenly a force so strong it bears down on them and closes the front of the tent. Igor Dyatlov manages to get his hand free and makes 3 slashes at the back of the tent. He can't tell if the howling is the wind, the man standing outside, or something else entirely. They climb out of their tent, realizing that they are in immediate danger. They lose their cool and scatter. The tent stands still, quiet. It will never see the hikers again. Hello and welcome back to The Anecdotalist, episode 20. I'm your host, Paul Packard, and actually tonight, not with me, is Jason McKinney. Normally, as you know, I have my co-host here, Jason McKinney. I'll tell the story, he listens, asks questions along the way. We made a joke during the previous episode that we might not be able to finish the whole thing because of the hurricane, and that joke actually ended up coming true. We split this into 2 parts. Jason still doesn't have power, still doesn't have internet, and so I am flying solo tonight on this one. He's going to be listening to this episode when you guys hear it on Tuesday. And if you're new to this podcast and you're hearing me for the first time, please, again, we did have a part 1. Go back and listen to that. But typically how this goes is I tell the story to Jason, and he comments and asks questions along the way. And tonight, I'm not going to really ask myself any questions, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my best to have a little bit of discussions as I go through the material here. Bear with me, please, tonight. I do not know how this is going to go. I've not had to do this by myself yet, so this will be very interesting. But we're going to jump into it. Not sure this is just going to be a wrap-up or have a full part 2 episode. My goal tonight is to make a full part 2, and that's what we're going to do. So, all that said, we're going to jump right in. So, when we left off in part 1, we were talking about some of the bodies that were discovered. And I want to jump right into where we were, because there was we were getting ahead a little bit with one of the theories, and that was the flying orbs in the sky, the fire orbs that are being seen. And we're going to cover that here in a minute. And before I do that, I want to jump into the rest of the bodies that get found, and then we'll jump into the autopsy, because I have all the information here, and we'll walk through kind of step by step what that looks like. So on May 3rd, Stepan Kurakov finds some broken branches in a ravine near the cedar tree. The search team starts probing the area, basically sticking metal poles down into the snow. And one of the poles brings up clothing. So the real interesting thing about this that I read when I was reading through this stuff, there's also pictures of it. Basically what happens in this area is the snow comes in, it packs in really, really tight, kind of like a glacier, how a glacier is formed. And eventually there's like 10, 12, 13 feet of snow. And so the way that they have to find these people that have been missing for so long is they take these rods, these metal rods, and they stick them in the snow, they drive them straight down, and they pull them up and see if anything's stuck to the bottom of the stick, the pole. And what they end up finding is this area, they stick the pole in, and they bring it up, and there's a piece of clothing on it. So they realize, okay, something is down there, we got to start digging. So they start digging out the snow, and it's a large 100 square foot area. And they get pretty deep. It's like 12-ish feet where these bodies are at the bottom of this ravine. And so they hit this riverbed below, at which point they start finding discarded clothing. So before they get to the bodies, they're finding kind of layers of clothing. And so they know they're getting close to finding more and more clothing. And then finally, they start to uncover the bodies. And it's the rest of the hikers. So the 3 men are pretty unrecognizable due to lying in the riverbed. I guess they were kind of face down in the water. And that, of course, does terrible things to the human body. The snow and the ice can preserve somebody so far, but when you have water just running and rushing below the snow and they're soaking in it, it's going to make them pretty unrecognizable. So 2 of the bodies are embracing, presumably to preserve body heat. And then Dubinina, who is recognizable, she's lying in a different orientation than the other three. And there's diagrams of this, and it's actually in our show notes. If you jump into the show notes, you'll see a diagram drawn of what that looks like. And she's kind of facing them. They're all vertical to her, and then she's like laying in the stream, and it goes down almost like a little bit of a waterfall, I guess, in a way. And she's up out of it a little bit. So she's actually preserved, and they can tell that it's her. The rest of the bodies that have been soaking in this water for a long time are pretty damaged. One thing I do want to point out when we talk about these bodies that are found here at the end, and I found this extremely interesting. So we talked about bodies that were found earlier that were missing clothing, that were in their underwear. One of the pant legs was torn away. What's really interesting is that Dubinina, she's actually wearing Krivonishenko's burned, torn trousers. And her left foot is actually wrapped in a torn jacket. And what that suggests is that she was with the other two that were at the cedar tree when they had the fire going. For whatever reason, she took the clothing of Krivonishenko and moved on with it. So I'm not actually sure what that would look like, right? Are they with the other two at the cedar tree? Did they start the fire? We know that they had their arms in the fire to some extent and burned. And so what the question was, that these two die and then they grab the rest of their clothing to try to just get some type of warmth, because everyone's kind of in mismatched clothing at this point. Most of them are missing their shoes. And at this point, those two people have passed, and maybe she's grabbing their clothing to then protect herself the rest of the way. And of course, they end up in this ravine, and presumably they fall into this ravine, can't come out. There's other theories about maybe possibly building a shelter in this ravine, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. But it is really interesting. I thought that when they do find Dubinina, she's wearing some of the clothing, the burnt clothing, not the jacket that was burned earlier previous nights. This is his actual pants that he was wearing the night that they went missing. So there's an autopsy that's done on all the bodies. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through each of these people by name and state their cause of death. So first there's Igor Dyatlov, and he passed from hypothermia. After that is Zinaida Kolmogorov, also hypothermia. Yuri Doroshenko, hypothermia. Alexander Kolyvatov, hypothermia. George Krivonishenko, hypothermia. Rostem Slobodin, hypothermia. And then this is where it gets really interesting. Nicholas Tibu Brignoli, his cause of death was a fatal skull injury. Simon Zolotarov, severe chest trauma. Luda Dubinina, internal bleeding from severe chest trauma. So the last three, of course, were the ones that were found in the ravine. But it's very interesting. So 3 of them died from some sort of trauma, which kind of just adds to the mystery a little bit. And when you talk about the theories, and we'll get into this here in a little bit, but you kind of wonder, is there something happening here? Is there something like a Yeti or a creature or something that's caused, it's like a car crash, for them to have this kind of internal bleeding, chest trauma, skull fracture? What kind of force would cause that? And we'll talk about some of the theories later, and I guess I'll speculate some when we get to that point. At this point, typically, Jason would discuss this with me, but he's not here, so we won't do that. When I think about these people that passed here in this autopsy, I can look at this list and say, okay, yeah, it makes sense that most of them died of hypothermia. But when I get to the 3 that had some sort of trauma, the skull injury, the chest trauma, it's a little bit curious. It's very interesting, because one of them, Dubinina, her chest injury is so violent that her right ventricle, her heart ventricle, is ruptured, and she had 9 broken bones, and it was also missing her tongue. You kind of wonder, okay, the tongue thing, is this from being gone for a certain amount of time and animals and things getting to her? But she's under snow. She's under like 12 feet of snow. So I don't know. It's really weird. And it's like, when you look at the ruptured ventricle, that's a car accident. Imagine how hard you have to be hit for something like that to happen, to break 9 bones, to have a ruptured heart ventricle. It just seems very violent. And the person that's doing the autopsy, he even says these 3 met a very violent death. And you kind of wonder if they are running from something, some unknown thing, some violent thing. Did something do this to them? Zolotarov, he has 5 fractured ribs. And then Tibu Brignoli, of course, he sustained the head trauma. One other thing that was really interesting that came out of this autopsy is that the hiker's organs had the presence of potassium-40, which is a radioactive substance. And you kind of think, okay, if these guys have potassium-40, a radioactive substance in their guts, you think, okay, some radiation, something happened, some radioactive thing happened to cause this problem. But there was a car accident victim in Sverdlovsk, not too far from here, who also had signs or also had presence of potassium-40. And so some of the stuff that I read about this was they had been testing a lot of nukes at this time. And of course, this is the 1950s, so they're leading up. We're like in the Cold War era. The space race is going on. And so this whole area, the snow and just the fallout that's been kicked up from these nuclear tests, it wasn't super uncommon for there to be radioactive substances or presences of this and people are around the area. And the levels that were in their bodies wasn't like a crazy number to suggest that they were in direct contact with something. But what's really weird is that the hikers' clothes, their decay rate was 9,900 decays per minute, which is actually almost double the amount of contamination allowed for people who work with radioactive materials. And so the investigators, they also suggest that the group would have been subject to an even higher amount of radiation if their clothes were still reading 9,900 decays per minute after being in the snow for as long as it was. And so some of that radiation would have dissipated. So the fact that they had presence of radioactive material in their guts, maybe that wasn't as big of a deal, but their clothing being such a high decay rate, something really fishy had gone on. And the question is, why was the decay rate so high? Why did they have such radioactive clothing when people that actually worked with radioactive materials would only be allowed to have about half of that amount? So I do want to make a quick final note here. So the lead investigator, Ivanov, he has these bodies autopsied, they're tested for radiation, all these things. And before he actually gets the radiation lab results back, his superiors suspend the criminal investigation. They basically say, we have all the bodies. There was no criminal activity here. We don't suspect foul play. This is done. This is over. The hikers perished from some unknown compelling force, which is odd because they hadn't even gotten the radioactive materials lab results back yet. Was the government trying to shut down something before that information was found? Because if he sent the information, the materials over, the clothing over, and the internal organs of these people, and they were testing positive for all this radioactive materials, the government shuts it down before they get the results back. When the results do come back, it's more than double that of what's allowed for people who actually work with radioactive materials. So that adds a whole nother layer here. It's like, why is the government shutting this down so hard? And additionally, the Ural Mountains, they're closed to hikers, and the permits are basically denied for the next 3 years after this incident. So you kind of wonder, you speculate, if the government's saying this investigation's over, we're done, nothing to see here, you kind of wonder, A, are they involved in some way? Or B, are they just like done with this? It was such a big thing. It looks really bad that they had these hikers that went through all these systems, and the Soviet Union, maybe they're just trying to just wrap this up before it becomes something bigger than what it actually is. But it does make you wonder, was there more here? So that kind of wraps up where we were earlier when we were talking in part 1 about what the timeline leading up to the theories here. And so we talked about all the players involved, all 9 hikers. We talked about where they were found, how they were found, the clothing that they had, and then, of course, their autopsy. So what I want to do now is I want to jump into the theories here, and I want to do my best to walk through these without Jason to question and probe me, but we'll see. We'll see how this goes. So I want you to think of all the evidence we have leading up to the deaths. So the timeline suggests this campsite was on a ridge as they were preparing to ascend the mountain pass. They were exposed to high winds and they were out in the open. One of the hikers was outside of the tent, relieving himself standing by the opening. An axe nearby, a flashlight in hand. Something caused the group inside to cut their way out and rush off in a hurry, traveling upwards of a mile. 3 of the group dead from some sort of trauma, the others hypothermia. That in mind, let's jump into this. So I have several categories here I want to jump into. And within these categories, I want to dive into actual specific theories because there's a lot here. And we're not going to go through every single theory that's come up for this mystery because there's a lot here. There's so much. I'm going to jump into the most common ones. And Even so, we are going to get into some exotic theories here, but there is quite a bit here. And so the first of this is that the group was attacked. And we can break this into multiple pieces here. So the first is it was the Yeti. And I know it sounds funny, but it might sound like a joke. But there is actually a disputed photo from the trip showing what appears to be a large human-like figure peering around a tree. So some claim that this figure is too large to be a human, and it has to be that of a Yeti. And that Yeti was trailing the group. It's also interesting because in context, the Yeti comes up in the diary a little bit as a joke, more so than anything. But one of the final photos taken is an image that looks a lot like a Yeti. And if you go online, of course, it gets a little hairy when you go online, but people talk about how high this thing is. They think it's at least 7 feet tall and all this different stuff. But in context, the photos that lead up to this blurred image of this supposed Yeti shows Nicholas T.B. Bernoulli messing around in the snow. And we know they joked often about the Yeti, and he easily could have been just acting the part. And so the photos that lead up to it, there's one of him like feigning distress laying in the snow, one of him walking off down like a trail. And so the speculation is if this is a picture of the Yeti that they caught and captured, why did this not come up anywhere else? Why did they not write about it definitively? Because there were photos taken after it. But most likely it was Nicholas playing a practical joke. And when you have a big mystery like this and you have something that's so over the top, of course, you're going to end up having people picking apart photos and siloed out. When you look at just that photo itself, you say, yeah, that does look like a Yeti or a Sasquatch or something. But in reality, it's just probably Nicholas messing around. So unfortunately, in this case, the Yeti is just a myth, like his North American cousin, the Sasquatch. So who else could have attacked the group? And so if you remember earlier, we talked about the Mansi people in this area. And the theory goes that the group of hikers wandered into a sacred land or a land of like religious significance to the Mansi people. And I guess the government really pushed this early on. They thought that this was the most likely cause, this indigenous people group up in the Ural Mountains. And if you think back to what we talked about at the beginning, the diary, it talks about the symbols marked on the trees. It talks about the Mansi people and the paths and the trails. And so you think, yeah, maybe this is it. But there's no real evidence of this. The only evidence that we actually have is that the Mansi people and the hikers were actually on good terms, and that they may have actually helped the hikers during the hike. We also know that the Mansis played a significant role in helping find the remains of the group. So there's just so little reason for them to have committed this act, especially since they are known to be peaceful. But it is kind of interesting because you think if these people were killed by somebody or something, the only other people that are out there are the Mansi people. So another attacker could have been armed men. So some sort of Soviet military exercise or escaped prisoners. However, again, there's just not a lot of evidence. But it is really funny because earlier we talked about the drunk at the train station who was sent to prison. And we jokingly thought, like, what if he had escaped prison and came out and caused this? One of the theories is escaped prisoners or a Soviet military exercise. But you kind of think, take a step back and you think about it. Why would the Soviet military come out and kill these kids in a tent or rush them off in a way that's odd? Like they all died of hypothermia, or the majority of them did. And so it's like, wouldn't they just finish them off? It was just a very, very odd thing to put it on the Soviet military. But that is one of the theories that's out there. And so I wanted to cover it because we are talking about the possibility of something, someone, or some people causing these hikers to run off into the woods. Also, to put a final wrap on some type of attacker, such as like the Yeti or the Mansi people or whatever, there's only 9 sets of footprints for the 9 hikers. So in the immediate vicinity of the tent, there's not really anything. But once you get further out, there's 9 trails and there's only 9 hikers. So you kind of think, well, if there's only 9 sets of footprints, the Yeti just magically float away, that the Mansi people just cover their tracks really well. Highly unlikely. It's highly likely that they weren't actually attacked. But if we want to continue to point fingers at the Soviets, we could also talk about some sort of potential weapon. Weapons testing wasn't unheard of. We talked about the nuclear explosions, the nuclear tests that were done. After all, there did seem to be some kind of attempt to cover it up. Maybe they weren't trying to cover up some covert attack, but some type of special weapon being tested in Siberia. So think about what's happening around this time. It's 1959. The Soviets are doing a lot of weapons testing. They're happening frequently, nuclear tests on a regular basis. And remember, we talked about the radiation levels on the hikers' clothing. we know that there were nuclear weapons tested 850 miles away. So Eichar, in his book Dead Mountain, which we recorded in part 1, he suggests that what he's uncovered from speaking with scientists and experts is that yes, the clothing had double that of what was considered safe, but an actual test or weapon being detonated would actually expose the hikers to 50 to 100 times those levels. So yes, the levels were double that of what you would expect, but it wasn't consistent with an actual nuclear explosion or a nuclear event. So the question is, was the test that was done 850 miles away earlier that winter, could that have contaminated the snow? I mean, they laid in the snow for days and days and days. Could laying in the water, laying in the snow, and their clothes soaking in, all that, if that test was done earlier that winter and the air and the atmosphere was contaminated and that snow was contaminated, maybe that's why their clothes came through with that kind of contamination. So I want to come back to Soviet weapon testing here, but I do want to take a quick detour just really quickly. The official investigation by Ivanov, remember, it was wrapped up by force, seemingly from the Soviet government. And so Ivanov was convinced that the orbs in the sky had something to do with the group's deaths. So we talked about those fire orbs at the end of last episode that other people had seen in the mountains through February. So the question is, were these some sort of Soviet weapons that were being tested? Or could they have been aliens? And of course you might be thinking, all right, we're getting into aliens. We always get into aliens. But you have to keep it in, especially if you have orbs flying in the sky. A final photo had the light smear and the fire orb on it. But outside of that, we don't really have evidence suggesting aliens. But orbs flying around in the sky really hasn't stopped us in the past from creating whole episodes dedicated to UFOs. But let's think about it for a second. The suggestion is that these UFOs spooked the group into a frenzy, causing them to flee the safety of the tent. That's definitely plausible. We don't have an abduction. We don't have any mutilation in the sense of what is typically associated with UFO encounters. It really just comes down to the group being spooked by the orbs. Furthermore, there's also some disputed timeline stuff here. The main claim is that the orbs didn't actually appear until later into February and kind of like March. And we know the group died on February the 1st. But there is evidence that the orbs were present on February 1st. So could they have been UFOs flying around at this time, causing some sort of frenzy with the group and for them to run away? Or were those fire orbs, coming back to the Soviet weapons, a part of some test that was done by the Soviets and they were trying to cover it up? So Ivanov's investigation wrapped up stating Dyatlov's group's deaths was due to an unknown compelling force. So something drove them from the safety of the tent. Not just fleeing the tent, but something caused them to mentally decide that it made more sense to run out into the snow to their deaths than to stay put in a tent. So this is when we get into a theory that a lot of people hang their hats on, and this is infrasound. So what is infrasound? Infrasound is low frequency sound waves that are below that of human audibility. So these low frequencies have been shown to cause feelings of fear or awe in humans. So the US government actually has tested what they call the brown note, a frequency of 0.5 hertz to 40 hertz, on human subjects that were subject to this frequency experienced motor ataxia, which is basically a lack of coordination in the body's muscles. They had nausea, visual disturbances, and difficulties communicating. So the suggestion is that this low frequency infrasound caused the group or compelled the group to flee their tent. Something drove them from the tent, and if there was a sense of fear or inability to think straight, they could just have panicked and ran off into the blizzard. So two things. Soviet weapons testing could have caused this brown note, this low frequency sound. Could the fire orbs be that of some test, some missile test or something that caused this sound? Or could it have been an actual natural occurring phenomenon? So there's a theory that has a ton of ground, and actually it's what Eichar states in his book is what he believes happened. The suggestion is that a horizontal vortex of some kind rolled over the mountain and past the tent. This heavy wind creates this vortex, and the hikers in their exposed tent would have been bombarded by this wind and the low frequency sound it created. And you may think, wow, this theory is way out there. However, it's one of the most leading theories to this group's deaths. And so it's not super uncommon for vortices and tornadoes to roll through this area. And we know leading up to the deaths, the wind was really hard and moving. So this vortex rolls over the mountain. Everyone's in their tent. it creates this like howling wind effect, which ends up being 0.5 hertz to 40 hertz, that brown note frequency. And over a period of however long, they're all in their tent. And eventually it drives them to some sort of mania, some sort of panic. They can't think straight. They feel there's like some impending doom, some problem, and they rush out of the tent. It kind of reminds me of like World War One. Everyone's in the trenches and their bunkers. They're being bombarded for such a long period that people would finally just absolutely lose it, and they would run out into certain death, because at that point it just becomes very animalistic. And then once they get away, once they get out and they get to the tree line and they start trying to save themselves, create fires or whatever, they realize, oh, we screwed up. We got to get back. And so 3 of them try to walk back. The other 2, of course, die at the tree. The other 4 in the ravine. And so if it was this sound, this brown note that drove them out of the tents, of course, when they got back to the tree line, or they got to the tree line and that sound was broken up, they would start to kind of regain and realize, hey, we're in some danger here. And they had the presence of mind to build a fire or try to survive at this point. So that's one of the big theories, is the infrasound frequency. The last 2 theories fall into natural phenomenon as well. I guess you can say infrasound is kind of a mix of both, because I kind of think of it as, we know that governments tested this sound. Maybe it was the Soviets testing it on them, or maybe it was a natural occurring phenomenon. And so what I want to do is dive into what other natural phenomena could have taken place here. So we referenced the wind a ton. And at the very beginning, if you remember back to the beginning of part 1, when we talked about what possibly could have happened, we know that the hikers were out in the open. They write in their diaries about how crazy the wind is, how heavy the wind is. And so the earliest suggestion is that when one of them left the tent to go to the bathroom, he or she got blown away from the tent. The rest of them rush out of the tent to help save them, and they also get blown off, of course. They get blown away. And that sounds very odd to me. I don't know if I can hang my hat on something like that. I could kind of see maybe one person steps out, the wind is howling and really busy. They get blown a little ways from the tent, realize that they're disoriented, they can't find their way back, and they start screaming, and the rest of the hikers come out to help, and they also get lost. But that just seems very unlikely. You would assume that a lot of them would have the presence of mind to put their boots on, to get dressed properly, and they wouldn't cut their way out of the tent. The wind blowing thing just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but it is a natural phenomenon, and it was a very early theory. And think about the other thing, too. This wind is strong enough to carry a 200-pound man, but one of the things to note is Slobodin is wearing a knit hat on his head. And when they find him, he's still wearing that hat. So you would assume if a wind is strong enough to carry away a 200-pound man, that his hat would also blow away as well. So I think we can kind of let that one rest. But it's something to think about, because it does come up. We do know that the wind was blowing extremely hard at this point. So the last theory is a natural phenomenon as well. And so this is like the avalanche theory, or there's the variations on this theory, and they call it the snow slab theory, and this is more recent. So Eichar, in his book, he just dismisses the avalanche theory. The tent was intact. The poles are still standing. You would assume if there was an avalanche, it would blow away the tent. You also have the fact that there was no reports of avalanches at this time in that area. So that, like a full-on avalanche, highly unlikely. However, the New Yorker published an article recently describing work done by Andrei Kurkov. And he settles on the theory that the group cut into the snowpack, creating a type of hollow to put the tent in. And in doing so, affected the integrity of the snow that was packed into sort of like a 3-foot slab. And so they would have done this to protect themselves from the wind. And there's actually photos from the expedition that shows as much. And so the suggestion is that they dig in. We know that they put their skis down for like a base. They put the tent on. And the way the tent was facing, they would have dug into the snow just a little bit to keep from being directly in the wind. In Kurkov's work, he talks about how cutting into the snow wouldn't necessarily make the snow collapse all at once. It could affect the integrity of the snow way further up and basically be a slow burn. And so at some point during the night, they're all in their tent. One of them gets out, goes to pee, whatever. He probably even comes back inside the tent. and the slab breaks loose and it partially covers the tent. Now, the group is being held in place and they're forced to cut their way out of the tent. That would explain why they couldn't get dressed. They had to cut their way out. They would have to climb out of the tent backwards instead of going through the entrance. Is if this slab had slid over just a little bit, just enough to hold them in place where they couldn't get dressed and they had to escape. We don't know that if they ran away or that they went running down the mountain. What we know is that they cut their way out, where they went further to the trees to create a fire or something. They would then realize that they're in extreme danger being out in the open and they need to get back to the tent. And so some of them try to make their way there. Some of them couldn't. The ones that couldn't, they end up in this ravine. And so Kurakov actually, he suggests that they go to this ravine because they know that it's low. They can get out of the wind. They can dig a small campsite for the night. They can dig into the snow. And that's something you can do as well. I've seen where people will do survivals where they'll cut into the snow and they'll lay in the snowbank and it avoids the wind. And if you ever build an igloo as a kid, you know that inside those igloos sometimes they can get pretty warm. Snow is a pretty good insulator. So they could have done that. Unfortunately, after they did that, they didn't realize there was a stream below. And the stream caused some movement, which caused all of that snow to collapse. And so either the snow collapsed on them, crushing their chest, causing damage. The snow slab that slid over their tent caused the physical damage to their bodies. We're not really sure, but they eventually were covered in snow. We know that they were about 12 feet below the snow in the stream when they were discovered. And of course, meanwhile, while that's happening, Dyatlov and a couple other hikers, they're attempting to retreat back to the tent, and they end up dying of hypothermia in the process. So that's all the theories. And at this point, typically what I do is Jason and I would speculate. We'd go through what we think. Jason's not here, so I'm going to speculate. I'm going to talk about what I think happened. So I'm not really 100% sure I can put my finger on the exact thing, but I think we can easily rule out the Yeti. I think we can rule out armed men coming in the night and forcing them out into the snow. What I want to lean in on, though, of course, I like the idea of it being some sort of UFO, lights in the sky or whatever. I think, like Ivanov, there was some compelling force that drove them from the tent. I actually like this ice slab theory. I think it's something that's pretty viable. That could have been the case. I, however, just don't see them absolutely losing their resolve because an ice slab slid over their tent. I really want to put this on the Soviets, to be honest. I think that we know that there's a lot of testing happening. In part one, we talked about how sketchy the government was, how they wanted to close this really fast. They wanted to wrap it up. I think that whether it was infrasound or something else, we made excuses for the radioactivity. We made excuses for the fire orbs in the sky. There's just too many missing pieces to rule out the government. I always think there's more to that. There's definitely something more going on there that we haven't uncovered. And the fact that they tried so hard to hide it, I think that puts something on them. May not be the whole thing. They might own some of this. I'm not sure how much of it they own, but I feel like the government was trying so hard to pull themselves away from it or to wrap this up quickly that they were involved in some way. I would ask Jason what he thinks, but you're just going to get silence. So, as always, thank you all for listening to another episode of The Anecdotalist. I know this episode was very different. It wasn't something I'm used to. It may come off different than what you expected, but still had fun wrapping up the Dyatlov Pass incident. So from here, we're going to get into October Spooktacular. That was supposed to start actually today, but with the hurricane knocking out Jason's power and internet and us having to split this into 2 episodes, it just caused a lot of confusion and frustration. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to wrap this episode up instead of pushing this further out and then missing out on our opportunity to make an October Spooktacular. So what's going to happen is next week we'll have October Spooktacular 1, then we'll have 2, and then we'll have 3. And the fact that I had to do a whole episode by myself, I'm going to have Jason do a whole episode as well. So he's going to actually bring his own story in. He's going to come to the table and tell a story to me in a different fashion. I'll ask questions and I'll badger him along the way, and we'll come up with hopefully a good episode. But again, thank you for listening to The Anecdotalist, and tune in next week for October Spectacular Episode 1.